Sitzung wird aufgenommen.
Hello and welcome to my talk on Easy First. My name is Klaus Frieler. I am with the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, Germany. And this is a joint work with Roger Beatty, Martin Norgard, Hannah Messil, Mary L. MacDonald, and Dan Weiss. Easy First bias in spoken language means that easier expressions appear earlier in speech utterances. Easier means here more frequent, synthetically simpler, shorter, or more important or more salient in the current context, or just easier to retrieve from memory. Easy First bias is thought to be more general and can be observed in different action movement sequences, and it reduces cognitive load and thus allows incremental planning. Since there are strong parallels of spontaneous speech and jazz improvisation, the question came up if there might be an easy first bias in jazz improvisation as well. And in order to answer this question, we conducted a corpus study. The operationalization was done by mapping language elements to musical elements. First, sentences are mapped to musical phrases. Words are mapped to engrams, means short melodic snippets. Easy was operationalized with difficulty measures, and first just means position in a phrase. Never use something which is not commonly known for language, which we call mid-level units, and they are kind of sentence types. I will explain this later on in further detail. Here you can see the complete flow chart of our study, and we will first talk about the corpus, the Weimar Jazz database. It's a well-known and publicly available database of high-quality monophonic jazz solo transcription. It contains 456 solos by 78 soloists from the US-American jazz canon between 1925 and 2009. It comprised about 200,000 tone events and 11,000 phrases, where the mean length of a phrase is 18 tones, which is rather long compared to other musical styles. First, we will talk about phrases and words, or engrams in this case. Phrases are perceptual and productive musical units. This is well known, and they can be seen in analog to sentences or utterances in languages. But there are no words in music because there is no fixed melodic vocabulary, anything. So we decided to use interval engrams instead. Interval engrams because they're transposition invariant. We could have used pitch engrams as well with similar results. And an engram is just a subsequence of a longer sequence of n elements. You can see an example of a phrase, and underneath it's the string of intervals from this phrase, semitone intervals in this case. And if you look at trigrams, so 3 grams, so to say, and they work like an as a moving window across. So you get, at each position, you get a corresponding trigram. Next, we will talk about the difficulty measures. Here you have Navarro, impression. And our first intuition was that larger intervals should be more harder to play or to perceive. And this can be expressed with the mean or the maximum of the absolute interval size. And this gives rather similar measures, as can be seen here. They have a similar contour. Then we figured that just the number of different pitches in an engram, or the number of different intervals, pitch variety and interval variety, should also be indicative of more difficult engram. And finally, we thought that the more angular a melody is, it should be more difficult. So we also use direction changes or average run length, which means the average length of identical intervals in a row. And they also are quite similar by construction. They can be seen as a proxy for difficulty measures, and in order to combine the different aspects, we used a method by just summing them up after standardizing them for different engram lengths separately, then summing it up, and then again standardizing. So we have standardized intrinsic difficulty. Intrinsic difficulty because it only depends on the interval structure, and all will we also have extrinsic difficulty, which depends on the corpus, and this was simply done by the surprisal or information content of an engram, which is the negative logarithm of its probability, which can be estimated by the relative frequency. And this was also standardized for separately for different engram lengths. And now we have a look at the mid-level units. The main underlying idea is that Solus use short-term action plans or playing ideas or design units. And the mid-level analysis was developed to somehow qualitatively describe these playing ideas by its musical shape or musical content. This was taken from the data itself and resulted in a gapless overlap-free annotation system with 9 main types: line, lick, rhythm, expressive, theme, quote, fragment, and void. I won't explain this further because in this study we only used lick and lines, the main types. They cover only about 80% of all mid-level units and also 8% of the total duration of a solo. Just to give you some example, here's the lick MLU. This is typically rhythmically diverse and sorry, sounds like this. Just one example. And there are also line MLUs. They are rhythmically more uniform and longer. This is the typical bebop sound. And as you should always use a control group in any experiment, we use a simulated corpus just to exclude the possibility that the easy first bias might be an artifact of a prevalence of simple intervals, small intervals. And for this, we used the exact same structure as the Weimar Jazz database, but we substituted the intervals with a simple interval Markov model of first order using transition probabilities estimated from the database. Finally, to see if there's an easy first bias, we used regression analysis of difficulty over phrase position. And because we have so large sample sizes, all the results are significant, so p-values won't be reported here. Instead, we show you some results. Here you can see the intrinsic difficulties plotted against phrase position on the x-axis. The blue lines are for the data, and the solid lines are for licks, and the dashed lines for the line MLUs. For instance, at phrase position 1 in line MLUs, we have still about 7,000 trigrams, and for lick MLUs at phrase position 30, so very far in a phrase, we still have 630 n-grams. Generally, we found that for lines, the values were below 0, so below than average. And for lick MLUs, we found that they are generally positive, so above average. We always see an increase at the very beginning and then a saturation after 10 to 15 notes. And for the simulation, we see indeed that this is a flat line, so no dependency on the phrase position. Similar results hold for the extrinsic difficulty, but a little bit weaker. And also they disappear for larger n because large n-grams are less often repeated. So the information content is maximal because they're constant, because they're just, most of them appear just once. One also could ask, because this was across the whole corpus with a lot of n-grams across phrase positions, if this also holds for single phrases. Do they show an easy first bias? In order to check this, we use Spearman rank correlation of phrase position against difficulty for each phrase in the corpus and different n-gram lengths. As you can see here, the correlations are all over the place, but you see a small positive median value for the data, whereas for the simulated corpus, the medians stay at 0, basically. So to sum up, we found a clear evidence for an easy first bias in jazz improvisation, as it was expected, which is stronger in lines than in lick MLUs and also stronger for intrinsic difficulty than for extrinsic difficulty. Overall, this is a weak to medium effect on the corpus level and it's a very weak effect on the single phrase level. There's a saturation after 10 to 15 notes, which might be indicative that easy first bias in jazz improvisation might come from using cognitive resources for action planning on the mid-level just before the phrase starts. And because this takes place, there is no cognitive resources left to plan the note level. So at the beginning of a phrase, the players tend to rely on more common, more easier stuff. And then it also allows them to plan the rest of the phrase. Yeah, so thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.